So I'd like to introduce Dr. Kevin Donnelly. Thank you, Kevin, if I can call you Kevin during the interview or during the Q&A. Wonderful, thank you. So Kevin has done an interview for ICMI 21, which has just been transmitted within the last hour. And now we've got a follow-up Q&A. Now, if there are any, I think if we've got any questions there. Oh, yes, we already have a question. Great. So Dan Sullivan says, I have an argument for cumulative education vouchers that you could use to college or trade schools. At age 25, you could cash in on what you haven't used. Would this pull the rug out from under the neo-Marxist indoctrination in our schools and universities?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Dan. And over the years, I've been following what's happened in America with the school voucher system, and also the idea of charter schools in America. And not as much in England, but in England, they did have academies and they did try and free up the system. And New Zealand are toying with it. But there are two issues here. One is having a voucher that would follow the child or the student through primary, secondary, possibly university. But if I can talk about school education, a voucher that parents would use to, when they decide what school their kid went to, whether it was government or Catholic or independent, the money would follow the student. And in Australia, we have one of the highest rates of non-government school enrolments, about 34%. So parents are obviously want the choice, want the flexibility. So some kind of voucher, I think, would be a great idea. And coupled with that would be the idea of giving schools greater flexibility and independence from the bureaucracy, from government, as they do in America with charter schools. So it's not going to work everywhere. Parents won't always have the choice in terms of where they live and what's available. But I do believe in two things. I do believe in autonomy and flexibility at the local level, what we call in the Catholic system subsidiarity. So the closer you are to the action, they're the people who should be making decisions, not bureaucrats 100, 200 miles away. So you need that autonomy at the local level, but you also need to have an element of competition, of the market working, so parents can make that choice. If they're not happy with the local government school, they go to the independent or Catholic school. And schools would quickly understand if they're losing enrolments, they're doing something wrong. So generally, I'm in favour, yes.
So if I understand correctly, the voucher system means that if somebody goes to a particular school, that voucher is given to that school and the government basically pays that school a certain amount of money along those lines. How does that differ from the charter school? I must admit, I'm not familiar with the charter school system in the US. Yeah,
there are two questions here. One is, how do you fund a school?
Yep.
So one way is government funding. Obviously, the federal state governments give money to the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy manages schools, builds them, employs the staff. That's a kind of top-down approach in terms of funding. In America, they're toying with vouchers. So instead of the money going to the bureaucracy or the education department, the money goes to the parent. So they've got a voucher and they can say, I will take this to whatever school I like and cash it in. That's different to charter schools, which is more how schools are managed and organised.
Right.
So charter schools actually have autonomy and flexibility to employ staff, to decide the curriculum,
right,
to decide what their focus is. So there are two issues here. One is funding, and the other is how schools are managed and organised.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so I lived in North America for a while, actually, and I lived in Canada, and they had the same system as the US, where they had sort of local school boards. And coming from here, I found the idea quite alien, actually. But it was interesting to look at how it ran compared to our system. So thank you very much, Dan, for that question. So we have a few other areas we could talk about that are areas of other than things we covered during the interview. So there's some interesting research on starting on the age at which children start. Oh, we've got another question coming in from the audience too. I'll just ask this one quickly. There's some interesting research regarding the age at which children start school. I believe some parts of Northern Europe, Finland in particular, children start quite a bit later than we do. And I understand there's some evidence that this may be beneficial. I want to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's not an area I've looked at closely, but I mean, my gut reaction is if you're looking at whether kids begin, you know, prep or the foundation year of primary school, whether it's 7 or 8 or 9, I mean, there's, I suppose, an argument that they might be more mature when they're 8 or 9, but having raised kids and seen a lot of nieces and nephews with their children, I don't always believe that. I think there are more important questions here, apart from school. What age, you know, is the school starting age? And that relates to the curriculum, to the pedagogy, what happens in the classroom, and also critically what parents have done at home in the first 7 or 8 years of the child's life. I'm a great believer in the argument that parents are the primary teachers of their children, the primary educators, and parents need to have laid that foundation in the first 7 or 8 years. Now, whether it's respecting authority, respecting older people, whether it's getting kids to actually close the computer, get rid of the screens, read a book or a picture book. There are lots of things that parents can do. So I don't think school starting age is a crucial issue.
Okay, no, great, thank you. So Douglas Wallace has a question. Says, I'm in the UK. I've seen more media reports of parents in Australia fighting against Marxism than most other nations, except France or Spain. Is this solution to cultural Marxism not so much trying to change the government, but teaching parents and even grandparents what is going on in schools?
The short answer is yes, but it's not a simple one to resolve. I mean, I've been arguing about the whole direction in which school education's gone for 30, 40 years. And in Victoria many years ago, when I was doing postgraduate work, a master's and a doctorate in the curriculum, it was obvious to me, even back then, that what I call the cultural left had taken the long march through institutions like schools and universities. And on my webpage, kevindonnelly.com.au, there are interviews about that and books that I've written about it. But very briefly, the school curriculum, and it's not just Australia, it's also England and America, for example. In America, there's parents are rebelling against Black Lives Matter and critical race theory, and the fact that the curriculum is so cultural left. That to a degree is happening in England, probably not as strong, because when Michael Gove was Secretary of State Education, I think he tried to sort of counter that. Could be wrong there, but that was my impression. But certainly in Australia, and I reviewed our national curriculum in 2014, it's cultural left, it's politically correct. And so there's very little, if anything, about the narrative associated with Western civilization and the growth of, say, Christianity, the impact of Christianity on our history, whether it's literature, music, art, whether it's abolition of slavery. I mean, it's fascinating. Our constitution in Australia, the preamble refers to God, as does the American Declaration. So when you look at our political, our legal systems, as well as our literature, our art, Christianity is something that's there underpinning it, but the curriculum never recognises that. So just very quickly, in Australia now, kids are told to study Aboriginal algebra. Now, I really thought algebra kind of went back to Europe and to Greece and, you know, Euclid and geometry and those kind of algorithms that have really, over the years, become part of Western culture. So I'm not quite sure what indigenous algebra might be. They're also supposed to do Indigenous science. Now, the reason why planes stay up in the air or bridges don't collapse is probably because of physics and, science that really goes back again to the Enlightenment and before then to Europe and Greece. So the curriculum in Australia is very cultural left. One way around that would be to give parents greater flexibility and freedom. And that gets back to the question of charter schools and vouchers, freeing up the system. The last point I'll make is that we've been in lockdown for nearly 2 years now. And in some states, students have been at home, learning from home for over a year. And I often get emails or phone calls from parents shocked at what their kids are learning because they can see it online or they see the work that's being done. And there are quite a few parents now starting to realise, and grandparents, that what their kids are learning or their nieces and nephews are learning, grandchildren rather, is very biased towards the left. And in Queensland, there is a greater movement now to homeschooling, where they actually take them out of the school and try and teach them at home.
That's a really good point, actually. I suppose, in a sense, it could be a little bit of a silver lining that it's opened some people's eyes, perhaps, to what's been going on, as we know, for a long time. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So Douglas Wallace says some colleges in the UK are now teaching feminist chemistry, and I've also found feminist physics online, which is, and also a feminist. I saw a discussion about a feminist programming language, which I thought was absolutely fascinating.
It was. And just quickly, I know there's one university in England, that might be Birmingham, I'm not sure, where the biology science department said they had to get rid of Western science and Western biology because during the Enlightenment or the 18th century, 19th century, science was complicit in imperialism and destroying whether it's Africa or Australia, but destroying the native culture and imposing Western. And that's all part of this sort of post-colonial movement now to deconstruct the curriculum in terms of power relationships. And whether it's, getting rid of statues, whether it's now actually fundamentally changing what they're teaching at university. And there are universities in South Africa, for example, where they want to get rid of Western science or Western mathematics and just do Indigenous. So good luck with that.
So on that topic, Kevin, I found a little while ago a course curriculum or a course description from the University of Toronto, where I have to say I used to work many years ago, about 15 years ago, and I'm really quite shocked and disappointed at what I found. But this is on the University of Toronto website right now, MAT 192H1, Liberating Mathematics. It won't take me long to read the description. Currently, mathematics is at a crossroads between tradition and progress. Progress has been led in large part by women mathematicians, in particular Black women, Indigenous women, and women from visible minorities. Intertwined in their studies of mathematics is a daring critique of traditional mathematics, reimagining of mathematics culture, and more. This course will compare and contrast new forms of accessible mathematics with standard sources that draw dominantly on the experiences and narratives of men. Restricted to first-year students. Prerequisite, high school algebra.
It is crazy. And just while we're talking about sort of cultural left, in Australia over the last 5-8 years, we've had a program called Safe Schools. It's got nothing to do with making schools even, safer. It's a radical gender program. And one of the people who wrote it, Ros Ward, agreed it was nothing about bullying. It was about imposing a neo-Marxist view of gender. So even in primary school, they were teaching that boys can be girls or girls can be boys. And so what's been happening, and, we can talk about history and university or science, maths, but one of the things I've been most troubled about is in primary schools now, they're denying the fact that biology tells us in terms of your XX or XY, that biology tells us that you're either a boy or a girl. They're now teaching young kids, 8, 9 years old, that gender is fluid and limitless, and you can be anything you want. And in one case, one of the brochures said, 10, 12-year-old kids, if they want to change their gender, they tell the school. The school doesn't have to tell the parent. So they're shutting parents out from this altogether. And the other associated problem with this, there's this respectful relationships program, which is going into primary and secondary, based on the assumption that men are misogynist, men are violent, men are dangerous, and that examples in Sydney and Melbourne in schools, boys are being made to stand up at assembly publicly and apologise to the girls for being boys. I mean, it's appalling that a lot of young boys are given such a negative, destructive view of what masculinity is.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's the thing. And I guess one of the things we're trying to do is provide an alternative viewpoint. We get shut down constantly by the mainstream media and so forth, but we try to put the information out there. So at least if people are interested, they're able to find it. And I suspect there's a lot of people out there who are looking at the information we're putting out.
Yep.
I hope so. So there's a question here from Carl. Within New Zealand, the government recently passed a law that those working in the health or education system who choose not to get the COVID vaccine can no longer work in these fields. In addition, unvaccinated students can no longer participate in courses that involve practicums or research in health and education settings. This is yet another example of silencing views that do not comply with the government. And Douglas has said in Spain, when we tried to get boys to apologise, parents pulled children out in strike.
So they should.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
I mean, we're facing the situation in Australia similar to New Zealand, where, I mean, I've been vaccinated. I didn't want to, but I realised, that I'm a bit older than most people. And if I want to keep travelling or lecturing or even being on campus at university and going to restaurants, such is the government pushing almost in a very authoritarian, totalitarian way, denying people freedom and the flexibility to have their choice. But I did it in the end. But I know there are hundreds of teachers around Australia who have not been vaccinated. And only last week they were told that if they're not vaccinated by next week, which is impossible to do, they're going to lose their holiday pay. And if they're not vaccinated by the start of term 1 next year, they will be dismissed. So we've got this kind of Orwellian approach now by government, where it's really denying people's rights and liberties. And even though 94% of Australians are double vaxxed, and, the argument from a lot of epidemiologists is that that's a safe place now where not everyone has to be vaccinated. In schools, universities, and even in health, people are being pressured to do it. And I think that's wrong. I think, even though I disagree, people should have the flexibility and the choice.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly, and that's certainly within the men's rights community. The overwhelming view is is to oppose mandatory vaccination. I personally have chosen. I oppose mandatory vaccination, but I personally have chosen to be vaccinated myself. But that's a personal choice I made based on my personal circumstances. So, right. So now Douglas mentioned about the boys. The parents had a strike when they tried to get the boys to apologise, which is really good because we've actually had a number of situations here in Australia at schools where things like that have happened. And going back a few years, we had even Clementine Ford refusing to take. There was a reported case where Clementine Ford was refusing to take questions from boys, and the media claims that it was the girls who staged a walkout.
Good.
So right, so I did want to ask you a little bit in the Australian context about the different states. Now, it seems to me that the difference, you did sort of allude to this a little bit earlier, but the different states do seem to approach the things a little bit differently. Would it be fair to say that Queensland is a little bit more conservative and a little bit more resistant to safe schools and so forth?
So what was that last bit of the question?
Would it be fair to say that Queensland is a little more conservative and a little more has been a little more resistant to safe schools?
I'd probably say no.
Okay.
I mean, many years ago, I actually reviewed the Queensland curriculum under a Liberal government a fair while ago. What's happened in Australia is we have a national curriculum, which I mentioned, and I reviewed that in 2014. The states and territories are then supposed to take the national curriculum and implement it at the state and territory level, and they can add a bit or change a bit, or they have a bit of freedom there, not a lot. But the real problem around Australia is that teacher training has been so captured by the cultural left that the curriculum's been feminised, not just in terms of the syllabus or the framework, the way they teach now English or mathematics, for example. It's been feminised. It's also what happens in the classroom in terms of the pedagogy, how teachers teach. And a good example that's been in the paper this week, I mentioned to you, we've just had our national NAPLAN results released, literacy numeracy testing at 3, 5, 7 and 9. And at year 9 in particular, boys are a good 10, 12%, I think, behind the girls in terms of their standard. And that's happening in primary as well. So when you look at something like reading or writing, the testing is now showing that boys are disadvantaged. We've known that. I've known that for 20, 30 years, because with reading, for example, the way they taught reading when I was at school was more structured and disciplined, and a more phonics and phonemic awareness approach, where you break words down into vowels and syllables and consonants, and you kind of look at how the language, the sound of it comes together in terms of the structure of a word or a sentence. But they moved towards whole language, where it basically became look and guess, work it out from the picture. The argument was that learning how to read was as natural as learning how to speak. Now, that's just wrong. It's wrong on every level. I mean, learning how to speak is something intuitive that we have, that we listen as a kid and we pick up the language and we experiment and we can generally get it right. Learning how to read is a fundamentally different process, cognitive process, and it has to be taught in a very structured, disciplined way. The way they move towards whole language, and this happened in New Zealand, parts of America, Australia, whole language disadvantages boys. And that's why in the national testing this week, boys are so far behind. And it's a great shame, because it's part of that larger question I raised about the curriculum being feminised. And in 1992 in Australia, we did have a review of boys' education, and I was on the panel looking at that. And at the time, we made the point that the curriculum was far too much biased towards girls to positively discriminate in favour of girls. The unintended consequence was that boys suffered, and that's still happening, which is a great shame.
Yeah. So as you say, I mean, you were talking about this in the early 90s. So this we've known this for a long time. Clearly, that if I understand you correctly, that the whole language method is disadvantages boys. This has been known for decades. True. So but very little has happened. So you did mention before we started that this year you think the media may be picking up on this a little bit more than they have in the past. Is that right?
Over the last week, on radio, TV, and in the press, the daily papers, there is a realisation now, because you can't ignore it. That's what the evidence is showing clearly. And the other point here is that Australian classrooms, if you look at the OECD research, we have some of the most disruptive and noisy classrooms among the OECD countries, especially at years 9 and 10. And you talk to any teacher, and boys can be a real problem. They're going through puberty. They often disengage. But it's made worse by the curriculum and the way things are taught, because instead of engaging boys' interest and motivating them and getting them enthusiastic and committed, the way teachers are teaching and the curriculum, kind of boys are getting back and saying, I don't like any of this. I want to do something else. So there's a whole area here that we haven't really looked at closely. And when I taught in a boys' school, we made sure that what we taught and how we taught actually reinforced boys and their sense of being confident. It's okay to be a bloke, as we say. It's okay to be male. So you can play football or cricket or whatever it is, and you can play the violin or the flute, or you can be in the school stage and be in the choir. We didn't sort of stereotype boys, as they often do in co-ed schools. So it's an interesting dilemma here for parents as to, if they have a boy in particular, how do they give that boy a good chance in, you know, what's going to happen at school? And it's a difficult decision.
And you also mentioned before we started too that there were a lot of women who'd come up through the system. They'd done quite well in the system, but now they're the mothers of sons, and they're seeing their own boys starting to struggle through and they're taking a different view of it.
I spoke to a couple of reporters only this week. I'll call them women because I'm still a binary kind of bloke that believes in men and women. Even though you might know in the United Kingdom, I think there was a decision only this week that passports would not have a third category.
Oh, would not?
That passports would be male or female.
Right.
So I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
But when you look at, I was speaking to a couple of journalists who are women, they have boys at school. So they're seeing firsthand what's happening to their sons.
Yes.
And they're concerned and anxious about it.
Yeah. So you did allude to, I was going to move on to a question about single-sex schools, which you did allude to, but I guess the question is, do boys perform better in single-sex schools versus co-ed, and also do girls perform better or worse in single-sex schools versus co-ed schools?
I mean, there's no easy answer in a way, because like in Sydney and Melbourne, some of the schools get the best results are selective government schools. So you've got boys' schools like Melbourne High. You've got Fort Street, I think it is in Sydney. They have an entrance exam normally at year 9 or whenever it might be. So they're selective. They've got a very special group of boys, and they'll always do well academically because they've been chosen to be high achievers. There are some co-ed schools that do well, but I've taught in both, and not just academically, they can be different, but also, as I mentioned before, I like the idea of a single-sex school because in year 9 and 10 in particular, but also 11 and 12, often kids can get distracted, especially now with all the social media and the sexting, the cyberbullying. And we found, or I found, at a boys' school, it was easier to keep the boys focused.
Right.
And this is just me being anecdotal. When you look at the year 12 results that have come out in Melbourne for Victoria this week, single-sex schools generally do extremely well.
Right.
Now, there are probably a lot of reasons why they do well. The gender is just one of them. As I mentioned, if they're selective, that's another factor. And also you've got to look at the teaching quality, the classroom environment. And the reality is a lot of independent Catholic selective government schools are very much geared up towards achieving good results.
Yeah.
So there are high expectations. There's testing at 9, 10, 11. They actually work it towards that goal of getting a good result at year 12.
Mm-hmm. And so certainly my familiarity would be that single-sex schools would be more likely to be private schools too. I don't know, do we have single-sex, I know you mentioned we have selective state schools, but are there single-sex government schools in Australia? I don't think so, are there?
There are one or two in each state.
Right.
So they're not selective.
Right.
I mean, where I live in Surrey Hills, there's a Canterbury Girls' School,
right,
which is a government school, all girls.
Okay.
It's rare. It's very rare, though.
No. And I guess my other question in relation to the overseas environment too, do we have more single-sex schools than, say, comparable countries, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, or is it, we certainly have, you say, a lot more private schools?
Yeah, I'm not sure of that one. I know with the enrolments at about 34%, it's probably one of the biggest enrolments in non-government schools across the OECD.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, you know, I could be wrong, but I think if you look at the UK, it might only be 5 or 8%. And America, about the same. So given that enrolment, you're going to have a lot more independent and Catholic schools.
Yes, in fact, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, and that leads to the whole debate, because the teacher union, the Australian Education Union, don't want that kind of flexibility and choice. So they want governments to stop funding non-government schools.
Right. Okay. Because yes, okay. So first of all, I was going to say I lived in, as I mentioned before, I lived in Canada, and the fact that there weren't as many private schools there was really evident very quickly from moving there. It's very quite obvious that that's the case. But yes, in terms of funding, a lot of people, even a lot of people in Australia, don't know that the government funds private schools here. So I think the argument is that the parents have taken their child out of the state school system and put them in a private system, but they pay taxes. So the school ought to get some money from that, and it's less than the state school gets, obviously. But they do put a proportion in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and a lot of people overseas have been surprised by that. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the independent schools around Australia, I think some of the figures, if those kids, say, you know, 20% of those kids in independent schools, Catholic schools, if they move to the state system, there wouldn't be enough schools or teachers to deal with it.
Yeah.
And because they're not in the state system, because parents are paying, I think it was up to $7 or $8 billion a year savings to government.
Gosh.
Because they don't have to fully fund those kids in the Catholic and independent schools.
Yes, and I don't know. I've always felt it was reasonable for the state to partially fund.
It makes sense.
Exactly.
I'm just seeing Carl from New Zealand talking about single-sex public schools. I know I did go to. Well, I've been to New Zealand a lot, but a couple of trips I went. I think it was Auckland Grammar, which is kind of confusing to an Australian, because grammar schools here are private schools. But I think Auckland Grammar was actually a state school.
Okay.
Run by the government.
Yeah.
So we've got to be careful here sometimes about the language we use.
Absolutely.
But I think the principal then was a guy called Morris, I think. But it was a great school, a very good school.
Yeah, the terminologies caught me recently in discussion, actually, where we have schools here that are called colleges, and that means something completely different, for example, in the United States. And I was having a conversation about education, and
that's right.
Yeah, so we do have to be careful to define the terms, I suppose.
Yep.
So do we have any final questions from our audience? We're heading towards our threshold now. So if we don't have any final questions, I think we might wrap up. Well, thank you very much, Kevin, for coming on and doing the live QA. We really appreciate it. And I think we've covered some really interesting areas, actually. So as I said, this will go up alongside the other videos for ICMI in the sort of coming weeks to a couple of months. And Carl's just said, thank you, Kevin.
No, wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Glad to be involved.
Thank you. And it's lovely to talk to you again.
Okay.